The sound of sobbing carried across the dry Wyoming plains like a wounded animal's cry, pulling Luke Frasier from his thoughts as he rode his bay mare toward Willow Creek, just outside Delta, Wyoming, in the summer heat of 1878. He had been alone for so long that at first he thought the sound was nothing more than the wind playing tricks through the cottonwood trees. But as he drew closer to the water's edge, he saw her, a woman in a torn calico dress, kneeling by the creek with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with each ragged breath. Luke dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the rocky ground, and the woman's head snapped up at the sound. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins, and her green eyes were wild with something that looked like pure terror. She scrambled backward, nearly falling into the shallow water, and raised her hands as if to ward him off. "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Please, I cannot go back there. I would rather die here than go back." Luke froze, holding up his own hands to show he meant no harm. He was a tall man, lean and weathered from years of driving cattle across the territories, and he knew he must look intimidating to a frightened woman alone in the wilderness. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and steady like he would with a spooked horse. "I am not here to hurt you, miss." "What has happened? Are you injured?" The woman stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she slowly lowered her hands, though she did not stop trembling. "I ran," she whispered. "I ran, and I cannot go back." "He will kill me if I go back." Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who will kill you, my husband?" The words came out broken, barely audible over the babbling of the creek. "Conrad Nolan. He is a rancher, owns half the land between here and Laramie. Everyone knows him. Everyone respects him." She laughed then, a bitter sound that had no joy in it. "But they do not know what he is. They do not know what he does behind closed doors." Luke's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before, had seen the bruises on women who claimed they had simply fallen or walked into a door. The frontier was a hard place, and the law did not always protect those who needed it most. "How long have you been running?" "Since yesterday morning." "I walked through the night. I did not know where else to go." She wrapped her arms around herself, and Luke could see now that her dress was indeed torn in several places, her hands scraped raw, her feet bare and bleeding. "I had to get away. He said he would kill me this time, and I believed him." I finally believed him. Without thinking, Luke shrugged off his duster and held it out to her. She flinched at the movement, and something in his chest tightened at the fear in her eyes. "Here," he said gently. "You are shaking. Take this." Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took the coat, pulling it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, and up close Luke could see she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23 at most. "Thank you," she murmured. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even that simple information was dangerous to give. "Florence," she said finally. "Florence Nolan, though I wish I had never taken that name." "Luke Frasier," he replied. "And I give you my word, Florence, that I will not let anyone hurt you, not if I can help it." Her eyes filled with tears again. "You do not understand. Conrad has men. He has money and influence. If he finds out you helped me, he will come after you too. He cannot stand to lose anything he considers his property." Property. The word made Luke's blood boil. He had spent his whole life working cattle, had been on his own since he was 15 years old when his parents died of fever, and in all his 30 years, he had never understood how any man could treat another human being like something to be owned. "Let me worry about Conrad Nolan," he said. "Right now, you need food and water and a safe place to rest. Can you ride?" Florence looked at his horse and nodded uncertainly. "A little. My father taught me when I was young before he passed. Good enough." Luke walked back to his mare and gathered the reins. Delta is only a few miles west of here. I know a woman there, Mrs. Harriet Chen, who runs a boarding house. She is a good soul and she will not ask questions you do not want to answer. We can get you cleaned up and fed and then we can figure out what comes next. Why are you helping me? Florence asked suddenly. You do not know me. You have no reason to put yourself in danger for a stranger. Luke met her gaze and saw the genuine confusion there, as if kindness was such a foreign concept that she could not understand it. Because it is the right thing to do, he said simply. And because nobody deserves to live in fear like you have been living. Fresh tears spilled down Florence's cheeks, but she nodded and allowed Luke to help her to her feet. She winced as her weight came down on her injured feet, and without hesitation, Luke swept her up into his arms. She gasped and stiffened, but he kept his movements slow and careful, showing her she was safe. Just to the horse, he explained. Those feet need tending before you walk another step. He settled her on the mare's back and swung up behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her. Florence sat rigid at first, but as they began the gentle ride toward Delta, he felt some of the tension slowly leave her body. She sagged back against his chest, exhausted, and Luke found himself hoping with everything in him that he could protect this broken woman from whatever demons were chasing her. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when they rode into Delta, a small but growing town that had sprung up along the railroad line. The main street was busy with the usual late afternoon activity, men loading wagons, women carrying parcels from the general store, children playing in the dusty road. A few people glanced their way, and Luke could see the curiosity in their eyes at the sight of a woman in such obvious distress, but most were too caught up in their own business to pay much attention. Mrs. Chen's boarding house sat at the end of the street, a neat two-story building painted white with green shutters. Luke had stayed there many times over the years during his cattle drives, and Harriet Chen had always struck him as someone who understood that not all stories needed to be told aloud. She was a widow, her husband having been one of the Chinese workers who helped build the railroad before dying in an accident 5 years back, and she had built a respectable life for herself, despite the prejudice she sometimes faced. Luke dismounted and helped Florence down, then knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, and Mrs. Chen's round face appeared, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. She was a small woman, barely reaching Luke's shoulder, but there was a strength in her bearing that commanded respect. "Mr. Frasier," she said, and then her gaze moved to Florence and her expression shifted to one of concern. "Oh my, come inside quickly." They stepped into the cool interior of the house and Mrs. Chen immediately began fussing over Florence, clucking her tongue at the state of her feet and hands. "We need hot water, bandages, and food," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. "Mr. Frasier, there is a room upstairs, third door on the right. It is clean and ready. Take her up, and I will bring everything you need." "Mrs. Chen," Luke began, keeping his voice low, "this situation might bring trouble. I want you to know that before you agree to anything." The older woman fixed him with a steely look. "Mr. Frasier, in my life I have known what it is to be treated as less than human. I have known what it is to need help and have doors closed in my face. If there is a woman who needs safety, she will find it in my house. I do not care what trouble comes with her." Luke felt a rush of gratitude for this fierce, kind woman. "Thank you." He guided Florence up the narrow stairs to the room Mrs. Chen had indicated. It was small but comfortable, with an iron-framed bed covered in a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the street. Florence sank onto the bed as if her legs could no longer hold her, and Luke noticed how she immediately positioned herself so she could see the door. "You are safe here," he said, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "I am going to step outside while Mrs. Chen helps you get cleaned up, but I will be right down the hall if you need anything." "All right," Florence nodded, but her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist before he could stand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Luke," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "There is something you need to know. Something I need to tell you before you decide to truly help me." He settled back on his heels. "What is it?" She took a shuddering breath, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit Luke like a physical blow. "I am carrying a child. Conrad's child, and he knows. That is why he said he would kill me. He does not want children, he never has. He said I was supposed to prevent such a thing, and when I told him I was with child, he said he would beat it out of me. So I ran. And I did not stop running until I could not run anymore." Luke felt the anger rise in him again, hot and fierce. The idea of any man treating a woman that way, let alone his own wife carrying his child, made him sick. But he kept his voice calm and steady when he spoke. "That does not change anything, Florence. You still deserve safety. You and your baby both." "But it makes things more complicated," she said desperately. "People will talk. They will say terrible things about me, about you if you help me. Conrad will use the baby as an excuse to come after me, to say I am kidnapping his child. He has friends everywhere, Luke. Judges, sheriffs, politicians. How can we possibly fight that? One day at a time," Luke said. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the trembling in her fingers. "Right now, we focus on getting you well and strong. The rest we will figure out as we go. I promise you, Florence, I am not going to let him hurt you or that baby." She searched his face for a long moment, and then something in her seemed to crack open. She started crying again, but these tears were different somehow, as if some of the poison had been drained from a wound. Luke did something he had not done in years. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, letting her cry against his shoulder while he murmured reassurances he hoped he could keep. Mrs. Chen arrived a few minutes later with hot water, clean cloths, bandages, and a tray of food. She shooed Luke out of the room with a firm hand and set about tending to Florence's injuries. Luke retreated down the hall to his own room, the one he always took when he stayed here, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to think through everything that had just happened. He was a simple man. He knew cattle and horses, knew the land and the sky, knew how to survive in the harsh territories. He did not know how to navigate the kind of trouble Florence had described, the world of money and influence and corrupt officials. But he also knew he could not turn his back on her, not after seeing the terror in her eyes, not after hearing about the child she was carrying. Luke had been alone for 15 years, ever since his parents died. He had never let himself get too close to anyone, never stayed in one place long enough to build real connections. It was easier that way, safer to keep moving and keep his heart closed off. But something about Florence had reached through that wall he had built. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or the courage it must have taken to run from everything she knew. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of being alone. The door to his room opened and Mrs. Chen stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. "She is resting now," the older woman said. "I cleaned and bandaged her feet and hands. She will need new clothes. That dress is beyond saving. I have some things that might fit her with alterations." "I will pay you for everything," Luke said. "The room, the clothes, the food, whatever she needs." Mrs. Chen waved a hand dismissively. "We can settle accounts later. Right now, I need to know what we are dealing with, Mr. Frasier. That girl has been beaten and badly, not just recently but many times over a long period. I have seen such things before, and she told me about the baby, about her husband." She paused, her expression grave. "Conrad Nolan is not a man to be trifled with. I have heard stories about him, about his temper and his pride. If he comes looking for her here, things could get very dangerous." "I know," Luke said, "but I could not leave her there by that creek. And now that I know the full situation, I cannot abandon her to face this alone." "You care for her?" It was not a question. Luke opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. Did he care for Florence? He had only just met her, had known her for a handful of hours. But when he thought about the possibility of Conrad Nolan finding her, of anyone hurting her again, something fierce and protective rose up in him. "I care that she is safe," he said carefully. "I care that she and her baby have a chance at a good life." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "I have known you for 5 years, Mr. Frasier. You are a good man, an honest man, but this path you are choosing will not be easy. Conrad Nolan will not simply let his wife disappear without consequence. He will come looking for her, and when he does, he will bring all his power to bear." "Then we need to be ready," Luke said. "Is there anyone in town we can trust? A lawyer, maybe, or someone who knows the law?" "There is a man, Daniel Wright. He is young but smart, and he has a good heart. He handles legal matters for many of the smaller ranchers and farmers around here, people who cannot afford the fancy lawyers in Cheyenne. I think he would be willing to help, especially if he knew the full situation. Can you send word to him? Ask him to come here tomorrow." "I will do so first thing in the morning." Mrs. Chen moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Frasier, Florence is very fragile right now in body and in spirit. She will need time to heal, time to learn to trust again. Whatever help you give her, make sure you are prepared for the long journey ahead. This will not be resolved in a day or even a month." "I understand," Luke said, and he meant it. After Mrs. Chen left, Luke lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around him. Somewhere down the hall, Florence was sleeping, or at least he hoped she was sleeping. He wondered what kind of nightmares haunted her, what scars she carried that could not be seen on the surface. He had not been lying to Mrs. Chen when he said he was prepared for a long journey. The truth was, he had nowhere else to be. The cattle drive he had been working had ended 2 weeks ago, and he had been drifting since then, uncertain what to do with himself. For the first time in his life, the endless movement felt exhausting rather than freeing. He had money saved from years of careful living, enough to keep him comfortable for months if he was prudent. Maybe this was why fate had led him to that creek today. Maybe after 15 years of wandering, he was finally meant to stop running and stand his ground for something that mattered. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of summer day that made the Wyoming plains look almost beautiful despite their harshness. Luke woke early, as was his habit, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Chen already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and his stomach growled in response. "Good morning, Mr. Frasier," Mrs. Chen said, glancing up from the stove. "I have already sent my boy to fetch Mr. Wright. He should be here within the hour. How did you sleep?" "Well enough," Luke said, though that was not entirely true. He had spent half the night lying awake, thinking about everything that needed to be done. "How is Florence?" I checked on her earlier. She was still sleeping, but she seemed more peaceful than last night. "I will take breakfast up to her shortly." Luke poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, cradling the warm mug between his hands. "Mrs. Chen, do you know anything specific about Conrad Nolan? Anything that might help us?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, her hands busy with the cooking. "I know he came to this area about 5 years ago, bought up a large ranch south of here with money he brought from back east. Boston, I believe. He presents himself as a gentleman, educated and refined, but there is something cold about him. He does not treat his workers well. I have heard that from men who have labored on his ranch and left as soon as they could find other work. And there have been whispers about his wife, about how she is never seen in town, how she seems to have no friends or social connections despite her husband's wealth. She was kept prisoner, Luke said quietly. Maybe not with bars and locks, but prisoner all the same. Yes. I believe that is true. Mrs. Chen plated the bacon and began cracking eggs into the hot skillet. There is something else you should know. Conrad Nolan is connected to the territorial legislature. He has made significant donations to certain political campaigns, and in return, he has influence with people in power. If this comes to a legal battle, it will not be a fair fight. Luke had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still made his jaw tighten. Then we need to be smarter than him. We need to find a way to protect Florence that he cannot simply steamroll over with money and connections. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, returning a moment later with a young man in his mid-20s. He was of medium height with sandy hair and earnest blue eyes, dressed in a simple suit that had been well cared for but was clearly not expensive. He carried a leather satchel under one arm. "Mr. Frasier, this is Daniel Wright," Mrs. Chen said. "Mr. Wright, Luke Frasier." The two men shook hands, and Luke gestured to a chair. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Mrs. Chen said there was an urgent matter that required legal counsel, Daniel said, setting his satchel on the table. She mentioned it involved Conrad Nolan. "I will be honest with you. Mr. Frasier Nolan is a dangerous man to cross. But I believe in justice, and if there is something I can do to help, I am willing to try." Luke laid out the situation as clearly as he could, explaining how he had found Florence by the creek, what she had told him about her husband's abuse, and the fact that she was pregnant with Conrad's child. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail. When Luke finished, the young lawyer was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "This is a difficult situation," he said finally. "Wyoming law, such as it is out here in the territories, generally favors the husband in matters of marriage. A woman is considered to be under her husband's protection and authority. For Florence to leave, Conrad could be seen as abandonment, and the fact that she is carrying his child complicates matters significantly. But surely there is some provision for a woman who is being beaten," Luke said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Surely the law does not simply allow a man to abuse his wife without consequence. In theory, no. Assault is assault, regardless of the relationship between the parties. But in practice," Daniel shook his head, "in practice, it is very difficult to prove, especially when the accused is a man of wealth and standing. Conrad could simply claim that Florence is lying, that she is hysterical or trying to escape her marital duties. Without witnesses or medical documentation of her injuries, it becomes his word against hers, and I think we both know whose word a judge is more likely to believe." Luke felt his heart sink. "So there is nothing we can do. We just have to hand her back to him." "I did not say that," Daniel replied quickly. "There are options, but they are not simple or straightforward. First, we need to document Florence's injuries while they are still visible. I can take photographs if she is willing. I have a camera for documenting evidence in legal cases. We also need her testimony, written down in as much detail as she can bear to provide. Dates, times, specific incidents. The more documentation we have, the stronger our case." "Case for what exactly?" Luke asked. "Divorce, ideally." "It is rare, especially out here, but it can be done under circumstances of extreme cruelty. If we can build a solid case, we might be able to petition for a legal separation at the very least, which would free Florence from Conrad's authority. The challenge is that divorce proceedings take time and Conrad will certainly contest it. During that time, we need to ensure Florence's safety. She can stay here, Mrs. Chen said firmly, for as long as necessary. Daniel nodded. That is good, but we should also consider getting a restraining order, something that legally bars Conrad from approaching Florence or this property. Again, whether he will respect such an order is another matter, but it gives us legal standing if he tries anything. What about the baby? Luke asked. Will Conrad have rights to the child? Legally, yes. A child born within a marriage is presumed to be the husband's and he has parental rights. That is part of what makes this so complicated. Even if we succeed in getting Florence a divorce, Conrad could fight for custody and again, his wealth and influence would work in his favor. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. However, if we can prove that Conrad poses a danger to the child, that changes things. A court might be persuaded to deny him custody or even to terminate his parental rights, though that is an extreme measure rarely taken. Luke ran a hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. So what is our first step? I need to speak with Florence, Daniel said. With her permission, I need to document everything: her injuries, her testimony, any evidence she might have of Conrad's abuse. Then we file the necessary paperwork and prepare for the fight ahead. But Mr. Frasier, I need you to understand something. This could take months, possibly even a year or more. During that time, Conrad will be actively working against us. He might try to have Florence declared mentally incompetent, or he might claim she kidnapped herself away from her lawful husband. He will throw every obstacle in our path that money can buy. I understand, Luke said. I am not going anywhere. The words hung in the air, and Luke realized as he said them that they were true. For the first time in 15 years, he was choosing to stay, to fight, to stand for something bigger than his own survival. Daniel stood and gathered his satchel. Then, let us go speak with Florence and see if she is willing to trust us with her story. They climbed the stairs to Florence's room and Luke knocked softly on the door. Florence, it is Luke. I have brought a lawyer, Mr. Daniel Wright. He wants to help you, but only if you are willing to speak with him. There was a long pause, and then Florence's voice came through the door, thin and uncertain. Come in. Luke opened the door and stepped inside, followed by Daniel. Florence was sitting up in bed, wearing one of Mrs. Chen's nightgowns, her face pale but more composed than it had been the day before. Her feet were still bandaged, and Luke could see bruises on her arms that had not been visible under the coat and torn dress. Miss Florence, Daniel said, removing his hat respectfully. My name is Daniel Wright. I am a lawyer here in Delta. Mr. Frasier has told me something of your situation, and I want you to know that I believe you and I want to help, but I need to ask you some difficult questions and document your testimony. Are you willing to do that? Florence looked at Luke and he gave her an encouraging nod. Mr. Wright is a good man, he said. You can trust him. She took a deep breath and turned back to Daniel. What do you need to know? What followed was one of the most difficult hours Luke had ever endured. Daniel asked Florence to recount her marriage to Conrad Nolan, starting from the beginning. She spoke haltingly at first, her voice trembling, but gradually she found her strength, and the story poured out. She had met Conrad in Cheyenne 2 years ago when she was working as a seamstress in a dress shop. He had been charming and attentive, buying her gifts and promising her a better life. She had been alone, her parents had died the year before, and she had no other family, and Conrad's attention had felt like a lifeline. They married quickly. Too quickly, she now realized, and moved to his ranch. The abuse had started within the first month. Small things at first, criticisms of her cooking or her appearance, controlling what she wore and where she went. Then came the first time he struck her, backhanding her across the face when she questioned one of his decisions. He had apologized afterward, brought her flowers, and promised it would never happen again. But of course it had, again and again, each time growing worse. He isolated her on the ranch, dismissing any workers she became friendly with, intercepting any letters she tried to send. He made it clear that if she ever tried to leave, he would find her and kill her. She had believed she had no choice but to endure. Then she discovered she was pregnant, and when she told Conrad, his rage had been unlike anything she had experienced before. He said he had no intention of having children, that they were nothing but burdens and expenses, and that she had failed in her duty to prevent such a thing. He beat her so savagely that she feared she would lose the baby right then. That was when she knew she had to run or die. By the time she finished, Florence was crying again, but there was also a sense of relief in her expression, as if finally telling the truth to someone who believed her had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. Daniel had been taking notes throughout, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed his anger and sympathy. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Daniel said quietly. "I know how difficult that must have been. With your permission, I would like to photograph your injuries as evidence. It will only take a few moments, and Mrs. Chen can stay with you to ensure everything is proper." Florence nodded, and Mrs. Chen stepped forward to help her. Daniel retrieved his camera from his satchel, and Luke stepped out into the hallway to give Florence privacy. He leaned against the wall, his hands clenched into fists, trying to contain the fury that threatened to overwhelm him. How could any man do such things to another person, especially someone who was supposed to be under his protection? 20 minutes later, Daniel emerged from the room, carefully packing away his camera. His expression was grim. "I have everything I need to begin building our case," he said. "Those bruises are extensive and in various stages of healing, which supports Florence's claim of ongoing abuse. I will file for a restraining order today and begin preparing divorce papers. But Mr. Frasier, I need to warn you, once Conrad learns that Florence is here and that we are taking legal action against him, he will retaliate. You and Mrs. Chen could both be in danger." "Then we will deal with that when it comes," Luke said. "Right now, the important thing is keeping Florence safe." Daniel nodded. "I will do everything in my power to help. In the meantime, I suggest you stay close. Conrad has been known to hire men to do his dirty work when he does not want to be directly involved. Keep watch, and if you see anything suspicious, send word immediately." After Daniel left, Luke returned to Florence's room. She was lying down again, looking exhausted, and Mrs. Chen was adjusting the curtains to block out some of the bright morning light. "How are you feeling?" Luke asked softly. "Tired," Florence admitted, "but also strangely lighter, as if some burden has been lifted." "Is that foolish?" "Not at all," Luke said. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "You have been carrying this alone for so long. Now you have people on your side, people who believe you and want to help. That makes a difference." Florence reached out and took his hand, her grip weak but warm. "Why are you doing this, Luke? You could have ridden past that creek. You could have left me there and continued on with your life. Why did you stop?" Luke looked down at their joined hands, considering the question. "I guess because I know what it feels like to be alone," he said slowly. "After my parents died, I spent years just drifting, not letting myself care about anything or anyone because it was safer that way. But safe can also be lonely. When I saw you by that creek, I saw someone who needed help, And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe I could do something that mattered. Maybe I could be something more than just a man passing through. "You are a good person, Luke Frasier," Florence said, tears shining in her eyes again. "Better than I deserve." "You deserve so much more than what you have gotten," Luke replied fiercely. "You deserve to be safe, to be happy, to raise your child in peace. And I am going to do everything I can to make sure that happens." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Luke found himself studying Florence's face. Despite the bruises and the exhaustion, there was a delicate beauty to her features, high cheekbones, a gently curved mouth, those expressive green eyes. But more than that, there was a strength in her that he admired, a resilience that had allowed her to survive Conrad's cruelty and still have the courage to run. Over the following days, a routine developed at the boarding house. Luke stayed close, helping Mrs. Chen with repairs and heavy work around the property while keeping watch for any sign of trouble. Florence slowly began to recover, her feet healing enough that she could walk short distances, though she still tired easily. Mrs. Chen kept her well fed, and gradually some color returned to Florence's cheeks. Luke found himself spending more and more time in Florence's room, talking with her for hours. She told him about her childhood, growing up as an only child with loving parents who ran a small farm outside Cheyenne. She had learned to sew from her mother and had dreams of one day opening her own dress shop. Those dreams had died when her parents succumbed to influenza, leaving her alone and struggling to survive. In turn, Luke told her about his own past, about growing up on a small ranch in southern Wyoming, about the fever that had taken his parents when he was just 15, about the years he had spent working cattle drives and odd jobs, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. He told her things he had never told anyone, and somehow it felt natural, as if he had known her far longer than just a few days. One evening, about a week after finding Florence, Luke was sitting with her in her room while she worked on some mending Mrs. Chen had given her. The lamplight cast a warm glow over everything, and through the open window came the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of a train. "Luke," Florence said suddenly, setting down her needle, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Have you ever been in love?" The question caught him off guard. Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking. "No," he said finally. "I have known women, been fond of some, but I never let it go deeper than that. Love requires staying, and I have always been better at leaving." "And now," Florence asked softly, "do you still want to leave?" Luke met her eyes and found he could not look away. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I do not want to leave." Something shifted in the air between them, a charge of awareness that had been building for days but had gone unacknowledged. Florence set aside her mending and Luke leaned forward, and suddenly the space between them seemed both vast and non-existent. "I know it is too soon," Florence whispered. "I know I should not feel this way when I am still legally married, when everything is such a mess. But Luke, when I am with you, I feel safe for the first time in 2 years. I feel like myself again." "Florence," Luke began, but she shook her head. "Let me finish. I do not know what the future holds, whether Conrad will find me, whether we will succeed in freeing me from this marriage. But I know that you have given me hope when I had none, and I know that when I think about the future, about raising this child, I imagine you there. Is that wrong?" Luke reached out and cupped her face gently in his hand, his thumb brushing over her bruised cheek with infinite tenderness. "No," he said. "It is not wrong. I feel it too, Florence. I do not know when it happened, whether it was that first moment by the creek or sometime in all these days we have spent talking, but somewhere along the way you became important to me. More than important." "I am still married," she said, and there was pain in her voice. I am carrying another man's child. I come with so much trouble and complication, Luke. You could find someone easier, someone whole." "I do not want someone easier," Luke said firmly. "I want you, and that baby you are carrying. If you will let me, I would be honored to be a father to that child, to raise them as my own. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Florence's eyes overflowed with tears, but these were different from all the tears Luke had seen her shed before. These were tears of joy, of relief, of something that looked almost like happiness. "You mean that?" "Every word," Luke said. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know the timing is complicated. But Florence, I have spent 15 years alone because I was afraid to care about anyone. I am done being afraid. I am done running from the possibility of something real." Slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, Luke leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle, barely more than a brush of lips, but it felt like a promise, like the sealing of some unspoken vow. When they pulled apart, Florence was smiling through her tears. "I love you, Luke Frasier," she whispered. "I know it is too fast and too complicated and probably foolish, but I love you." "I love you too," Luke said, and the words felt right, felt true in a way nothing else ever had. They sat together in the lamplight, holding hands, neither of them speaking, both of them simply absorbing the magnitude of what had just been acknowledged between them. Luke knew that loving Florence would not make the challenges ahead any easier, but somehow, having her love in return made him feel stronger, more capable of facing whatever storm was coming. The storm arrived 3 days later in the form of Conrad Nolan himself. Luke was in the stable behind the boarding house, tending to his horse, when he heard the sound of multiple riders approaching. He stepped out into the yard and saw 6 men on horseback coming down the street, led by a tall figure in an expensive suit, riding a black stallion. Even from a distance, Luke could tell this was Conrad Nolan. There was an arrogance in the way he sat his horse, a sense of entitlement that radiated from him like heat. Luke quickly made his way back to the house, entering through the kitchen door. "Mrs. Chen, Conrad Nolan is here with several men. Get Florence upstairs and make sure she stays out of sight." Mrs. Chen paled but moved quickly, hurrying up the back stairs. Luke positioned himself in the front hallway, his hand resting on the grip of the revolver he wore at his hip. He rarely carried the weapon in town, but Daniel Wright's warnings had convinced him it was necessary. The pounding on the front door came moments later, aggressive and demanding. Luke waited a beat, then opened the door, blocking the entrance with his body. Conrad Nolan was a handsome man in his late 30s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and cold blue eyes that assessed Luke with obvious disdain. He was well dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots, every inch the successful rancher. The 5 men with him were clearly hired hands, rough-looking men with hard faces and guns on their hips. "I am looking for my wife," Conrad said without preamble. His voice was cultured, educated, but there was steel beneath the polish. "I have been informed that she is being kept here against her will. I demand you release her to me immediately." "Florence is not being kept anywhere against her will," Luke said evenly. "She is here of her own choice, and she has made it clear she does not wish to return to you." Conrad's expression did not change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "My wife is not in her right mind. She is prone to hysteria and flights of fancy. I am sure whatever lies she has told you are very convincing, but the fact remains that she is my wife, and she belongs with me. Now step aside." "No," Luke said. The men behind Conrad shifted, hands moving toward their weapons. Luke kept his own hand near his revolver but did not draw. The last thing he wanted was a gunfight in the middle of town. "You are interfering with a man's legal right to his wife," Conrad said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "That is kidnapping, and I have every right to retrieve my property by whatever means necessary." "She is not property," Luke said, anger heating his words. "She is a human being and she has rights of her own. We have filed legal papers, Mr. Nolan. There is a restraining order that bars you from approaching Florence. If you do not leave now, I will have the sheriff here to enforce it." Conrad laughed, a cold sound without humor. "The sheriff? Do you really think Robert Carter is going to choose the side of some drifting cowboy and a hysterical woman over mine? I donate generously to his campaign fund. He knows where his loyalties lie." "Then we will go over his head," a new voice said from behind Luke. He glanced back to see Daniel Wright stepping into the hallway, carrying his leather satchel. "Federal marshals take a dim view of men who violate court orders, Mr. Nolan, regardless of how much money they have donated to local politics." Conrad's eyes narrowed as he focused on Daniel. "Mr. Wright, I should have known you would be involved in this, always sticking your nose where it does not belong, championing lost causes." "Justice is not a lost cause," Daniel replied calmly, "and Florence Nolan has every right to seek protection from an abusive husband. The evidence is documented and extensive. I would suggest you return to your ranch and wait for the court proceedings to begin, rather than making things worse for yourself by attempting to violate a restraining order." For a long moment, the two groups faced off, tension crackling in the air. Luke could see Conrad weighing his options, could see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes. Finally, Conrad took a step back. "This is not over," he said, his gaze moving between Luke and Daniel. "Florence is my wife, and that child she carries is mine. I will use every resource at my disposal to bring her home where she belongs, and anyone who stands in my way will regret it. That is not a threat, gentlemen. That is a promise." He turned and strode back to his horse, mounting in one fluid motion. His men followed suit, and the group rode off down the street, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Luke let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. That went about as well as expected. "He will not give up," Daniel said, watching the riders disappear. "He will fight this with everything he has. We need to be prepared for a long, ugly battle." "Then that is what we will give him," Luke said. He closed the door and turned to find Florence standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and her hand pressed against her stomach. "Florence, are you all right?" She came down the stairs slowly, and Luke met her halfway, wrapping an arm around her waist to steady her. "I heard his voice," she said, trembling. "Even through the walls I could hear him, and I felt like I could not breathe." "He is gone now," Luke said soothingly, "and he cannot touch you, not while I am here." "He will not stop," Florence said, echoing Daniel's words. "He cannot stand to lose, especially not to people he considers beneath him. He will make all of you suffer for helping me." "Let him try," Luke said fiercely. "We are not afraid of him." Over the following weeks, Conrad made good on his promise to make their lives difficult. He filed countersuits, claiming that Florence was mentally incompetent and that Luke had kidnapped her. He spread rumors through town, painting himself as a wronged husband and Florence as an unfaithful wife who had abandoned her marriage vows. Some people believed him he was charming and convincing, and his money spoke loudly in certain circles, but others did not. Daniel Wright worked tirelessly, building their case and reaching out to other lawyers in the territory who were known for taking on difficult cases against powerful men. Mrs. Chen stood firm, refusing to be intimidated by veiled threats from Conrad's men. And gradually, a small community of support formed around Florence's other women who had suffered in silence, shopkeepers who had seen Conrad's true nature, ranch hands who had worked for him and knew his cruelty firsthand. The case was set for a hearing in Cheyenne in November, nearly 4 months after Luke had found Florence by the creek. During that time, Florence grew stronger both physically and emotionally. Her bruises faded, her feet healed, and the pinched, fearful look in her eyes was gradually replaced by something softer and more hopeful. Her pregnancy advanced, and by September, she was visibly showing, her belly rounding gently beneath the simple dresses Mrs. Chen had altered for her. Luke and Florence's relationship deepened as the weeks passed. They were careful to maintain propriety. Florence still slept in her own room, and they were never alone behind closed doors without Mrs. Chen nearby. But they spent every possible moment together, talking, laughing, sharing their dreams for the future. One evening in late September, as the first hints of autumn cooled the air, Luke and Florence sat together on the front porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the plains. Florence had been quiet all day, and Luke could sense something weighing on her mind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her hand in his. Florence was quiet for a moment, her free hand resting on her belly. "The baby," she said finally. "I am thinking about what happens after the baby is born. In December or January, Daniel says, based on when I think conception occurred. That is after the hearing, but probably before any final divorce decree. What about it worries you?" "The baby will be born while I am still legally Conrad's wife. That means, in the eyes of the law, Conrad has full parental rights. What if he tries to take the baby from me? What if the court sides with him because he is the legal father and I am just a hysterical woman who abandoned her marriage?" Her voice was rising with panic. "Luke, I cannot let him have this child. I would rather run again, disappear somewhere he can never find us than let him raise my baby." Luke squeezed her hand gently, trying to calm her. "That is not going to happen," he said firmly. "Daniel has been very clear about this. We have documented evidence of Conrad's abuse, of his threats toward you and the baby. No judge is going to hand an infant over to a man like that, no matter what his legal rights might technically be." "But what if they do?" Florence insisted. "What if money and influence matter more than justice?" Luke turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Then we will run," he said. "If it comes to that, if the law fails you, then we will take the baby and go somewhere Conrad can never find us. Canada, maybe, or California. I have enough money saved to get us started somewhere new. But Florence, I do not think it will come to that. I believe in what we are doing, and I believe we are going to win." Tears slipped down Florence's cheeks. "I am so afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid to hope, afraid to believe that I might actually get to keep my baby and have a life with you. It feels too good to be true, like something that will be snatched away the moment I let myself really believe in it." "I know," Luke said, pulling her into his arms as carefully as he could given her growing belly. "I am afraid too, but we face that fear together, all right. Whatever happens, we face it together." Florence nodded against his chest, and they sat that way until the stars came out, holding each other against the darkness and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The hearing in Cheyenne arrived with the cold winds of November. Luke, Florence, Daniel, and Mrs. Chen made the journey by train, a tense trip during which Florence barely spoke. She was 6 months pregnant now, and the baby's movements were visible even through her dress. Luke found himself constantly watching her, ready to support her or comfort her at the slightest sign of distress. The courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone, and when they entered the courtroom, Luke's heart sank to see Conrad Nolan already seated at a table with not one but 3 expensive lawyers arrayed around him. Conrad looked confident, almost smug, as he watched them take their seats on the opposite side of the room. The judge was an older man named Harrison Blackwell, with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. Daniel had told them that Judge Blackwell had a reputation for fairness, but also for following the letter of the law regardless of emotional circumstances. It would be a tough room, Daniel had warned, but not an impossible one. The hearing began with Conrad's lawyers laying out their case. They painted Florence as an unstable, ungrateful wife who had abandoned her loving husband without cause. They suggested she had been influenced by Luke, a drifting cowboy who had preyed upon a vulnerable woman for his own purposes. They argued that Conrad had every right to retrieve his wife and unborn child, and that the restraining order was an unjust interference with his legal rights. It took everything Luke had to sit still and silent while they spoke, listening to them twist the truth into something unrecognizable. He could feel Florence trembling beside him, could see her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood and presented their evidence with calm, methodical precision. He showed the photographs of Florence's injuries, had her testimony read aloud, and called witnesses ranch hands who had worked for Conrad and quit in disgust, a doctor who examined Florence and confirmed the extent and pattern of her injuries, even Mrs. Chen, who testified about Florence's condition when she first arrived at the boarding house. Finally, Daniel called Florence herself to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head held high, though Luke could see the fear in her eyes. Conrad's lawyers tried to shake her testimony, tried to suggest she was lying or exaggerating, but Florence held firm. She spoke clearly and honestly about her marriage, about the abuse she had suffered, about her fear for her unborn child. Mrs. Nolan, Judge Blackwell said when the lawyers had finished their questions. Why did you not seek help before now? Why did you not go to the authorities if your husband was truly treating you as you claim? Florence met the judge's gaze directly. Because I was afraid, Your Honor. My husband made it very clear what would happen if I told anyone. He isolated me on his ranch, dismissed any workers I became friendly with, controlled every aspect of my life. And when I finally worked up the courage to tell a neighbor that I was unhappy, Conrad found out and beat me so badly I could not leave my bed for a week. After that, I was too terrified to try again. It was only when he threatened to kill me and my unborn child that I found the strength to run. And yet you found the strength to make very serious accusations against a prominent member of this community, the judge observed. Accusations that could ruin Mr. Nolan's reputation and standing. I found the strength because I had help, Florence said, and her eyes moved to Luke. I found someone who believed me, who protected me, who showed me that not all men are cruel. Luke Frasier saved my life and the life of my child, and I will be grateful to him for the rest of my days. The hearing lasted 2 full days. At the end of the second day, Judge Blackwell announced he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within a week. They returned to Delta to wait, and those were some of the longest days of Luke's life. Finally, 8 days after the hearing, a telegram arrived from Daniel, who had stayed in Cheyenne. Luke's hands shook as he read it aloud to Florence and Mrs. Chen. Ruling in our favor. Restraining order made permanent. Divorce granted on grounds of extreme cruelty. Conrad's parental rights suspended pending further review. Coming home tomorrow with official documents. We won. Florence burst into tears, and this time they were pure relief. Luke pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she sobbed against his shoulder. Mrs. Chen was crying too, and even Luke felt his eyes sting with emotion. It is over, Florence kept saying. It is really over. It is over, Luke confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You are free, Florence. You and the baby are safe. Daniel returned the next day with the official court documents. The judge's ruling had been thorough and damning. He had found credible evidence of extensive abuse and had concluded that Conrad Nolan posed a significant danger to both Florence and the unborn child. The divorce was granted. Florence was awarded the house and property she had brought to the marriage from her parents' estate, and Conrad was ordered to pay support but was barred from any contact with Florence or the child. He could appeal, Daniel warned. He has the resources to take this to a higher court, but the ruling is so thorough and the evidence so strong that I doubt any appeals court would overturn it. You are legally free, Florence. That night, Luke asked Florence to marry him. They were alone in the parlor of the boarding house, the fire crackling in the hearth and the November wind howling outside. Luke went down on one knee, holding a simple gold band he had purchased that afternoon from the jeweler in town. Florence Nolan, soon to be Florence Nelson again, he said, smiling up at her. I know we have only known each other for 5 months. I know this is fast and probably not the most romantic proposal you could have imagined. But I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you and your child. Will you marry me? Florence was crying again, but she was smiling too, the most genuine, joyful smile Luke had ever seen on her face. Yes, she said. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Luke slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that was deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, Florence laughed, a sound of pure happiness that Luke wanted to hear every day for the rest of his life. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Delta. Mrs. Chen stood up as Florence's witness, and Daniel served as Luke's. The pastor who married them was kind and understanding, and he did not judge Florence for her situation or the visible evidence of her pregnancy. Instead, he blessed their union and wished them many happy years together. After the ceremony, they moved into a small house Luke had purchased on the edge of town with his savings. It was not much, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor, but it was theirs, and Florence set about making it a home with an enthusiasm that warmed Luke's heart. She sewed curtains and quilts, arranged their modest furniture, and prepared a nursery for the baby with care and love. Their daughter was born in late January of 1879, during a snowstorm that blanketed Delta in white. The labor was long and difficult, and Luke spent hours pacing the hallway while Mrs. Chen and the midwife attended to Florence. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, he felt something in his chest crack open, some final wall he had been keeping around his heart. The midwife emerged from the bedroom, smiling. You have a healthy daughter, Mr. Frasier, and your wife is doing well. Luke rushed into the room to find Florence propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tears of joy streaming down her face. Luke, come meet our daughter, she said softly. Luke approached the bed and looked down at the baby for the first time. She was small and perfect, with a wisp of dark blonde hair and her mother's delicate features. Her eyes were closed, her tiny fists waving slightly, and Luke felt love crash over him with the force of a stampede. She is beautiful, he whispered, just like her mother. What should we name her? Florence asked. They had discussed names over the past few weeks, but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his new daughter, one name came to Luke's mind. Hope, he said. Let's name her Hope, because she represents the hope we have for the future, the hope that brought us together. Florence smiled through her tears. Hope Frasier. I love it. Luke carefully took the baby from Florence, cradling her against his chest. Hope stirred and made a small sound, and Luke felt his heart swell to impossible size. I promise you, he murmured to his daughter. I promise I will always protect you and your mother. I promise you will grow up knowing you are loved and safe. I promise to be the best father I can be." Hope seemed to settle at the sound of his voice, and Luke marveled at the weight of her in his arms, this tiny person who had changed everything. The first months of Hope's life were challenging but joyful. Luke took work as a foreman at a nearby ranch, steady employment that allowed him to come home to his family every night. Florence proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving with Hope, despite the sleepless nights and constant demands of an infant. Luke helped however he could, walking Hope around the house at night when she was fussy, changing diapers, and simply being present in a way his own father had been before his death. There was no word from Conrad Nolan. Daniel kept them informed of any legal developments, and it seemed that Conrad had decided not to appeal the judge's ruling. Whether that was because he knew he would lose or simply because he had decided Florence and Hope were not worth the continued effort, Luke did not know and did not care. What mattered was that they were safe, truly and finally safe. As winter gave way to spring and then summer, their little family settled into a comfortable rhythm. Luke proved to be good at his work, and his employer offered him a partnership in the ranch, a chance to build something lasting. Florence started taking in sewing again, not because they needed the money, but because she enjoyed it. And soon she had a steady stream of customers who appreciated her skill and fair prices. Hope grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby who laughed at everything and loved nothing more than being held by her father. Luke would come home from work each day, and Hope would reach for him, squealing with delight, and that simple gesture never failed to make him smile. One evening in August, as they sat on their porch watching Hope play with a rag doll Florence had made her, Luke turned to his wife and took her hand. "Are you happy?" he asked. Florence looked at him with those green eyes that had first captivated him by the creek more than a year ago. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," she said. "A year ago I was convinced I would die at Conrad's hands. I thought I had no future, no hope, and now look at us. We have a home, a beautiful daughter, each other. It feels like a miracle." "You are the miracle," Luke said softly. "You and Hope both. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to finally build a life instead of just surviving." Florence leaned over and kissed him, slow and sweet. "We saved each other," she said when they parted. "That day at the creek, you saved me, but I think maybe I saved you too." Luke thought about that and realized she was right. He had been so lost before finding Florence, so adrift and alone. She had given him purpose, direction, and love. They had saved each other, and together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate pain. "I love you, Florence Frasier," Luke said. "I love you too," Florence replied. Hope chose that moment to toddle over, her unsteady baby steps bringing her to Luke's legs. He scooped her up and settled her on his lap, and the three of them sat together in the warm summer evening, a family forged in adversity but thriving in peace. The years passed with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Luke's partnership in the ranch proved prosperous, and within 5 years, he and Florence had saved enough to purchase land of their own, a modest spread just outside Delta where they raised horses and cattle. It was hard work, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and sweat, and that made all the difference. Hope grew into a bright, spirited child with her mother's beauty and her father's steady nature. She loved the horses especially, and Luke taught her to ride almost as soon as she could walk. By the time she was 8 years old, she could handle a horse as well as many grown men, and Luke could not have been more proud. In 1882, Florence gave birth to their second child, a son they named Samuel after Luke's father. Samuel was as different from Hope as could be, where she was adventurous and outgoing. He was thoughtful and quiet, preferring books to horses. But he had a gentle heart and a sharp mind, and Luke loved him just as fiercely as he loved Hope. 2 years later, another daughter arrived, Lily, who was equal parts mischief and charm. She kept Florence busy with her antics, and there were many evenings when Luke would come home to find Florence exasperated but laughing at whatever Lily had gotten into that day. The family grew and thrived, and Luke found that the loneliness that had defined so much of his earlier life had completely disappeared, replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose he had never imagined possible. He was a husband, a father, a rancher, a member of the community. He had roots, deep and strong, anchored by his love for Florence and their children. They heard, through Daniel Wright, that Conrad Nolan had left Wyoming in 1881, reportedly moving to San Francisco after some business dealings went sour. There were rumors of debts and gambling losses, of a once proud man brought low by his own vices. Luke felt no satisfaction in Conrad's downfall, only relief that the man was far away and no longer a threat to his family. Florence bloomed in the years of their marriage. The frightened, broken woman Luke had found by the creek was gone, replaced by someone confident and strong. She became known throughout Delta as someone who would help other women in difficult situations, offering them support and resources when they needed to escape dangerous circumstances. She and Mrs. Chen worked together on this, creating an informal network of safe houses and supportive friends. It was Florence's way of paying forward the help she had received, and Luke admired her for it. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December of 1888, Luke took Florence out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Delta. The children stayed with Mrs. Chen, who despite being in her 60s now was still spry and delighted to spend time with Hope, Samuel, and Lily. Over dessert, Florence reached across the table and took Luke's hand. "Do you remember the day you found me?" she asked. "Every detail," Luke said. "You were by Willow Creek, crying like your heart was broken. You were so frightened and so brave at the same time." "I thought my life was over," Florence said softly. "I thought I had reached the end of everything, and then you stopped. Out of all the people who might have ridden past that creek that day, it was you. Do you ever think about that? About how different everything would have been if you had taken a different route, or if you had decided my crying was none of your business?" Luke had thought about it many times over the years. "I think we were meant to find each other," he said. "I do not know if I believe in fate or divine providence or anything like that, but I know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children are everything to me, Florence. Everything." "We have built a good life," Florence said, smiling. "Better than I ever dreamed possible, and it all started with your kindness, with your willingness to help a stranger in need." "You were never just a stranger," Luke said. "From the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. Like we were two pieces that had been wandering separately, waiting to find each other and finally become whole." They finished their dinner and walked home through the December cold, hand in hand, talking and laughing like they were young lovers instead of an old married couple. When they reached their house, the windows glowed with warm light, and they could hear the children's laughter from inside where they were playing with Mrs. Chen. Luke stopped on the porch and pulled Florence into his arms, kissing her with all the love and passion that 10 years of marriage had not diminished but only strengthened. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "Thank you," Florence whispered. "For what?" "For stopping that day. For caring. For loving me and Hope when you had no reason to. For giving me a life I never thought I could have." "Thank you for trusting me," Luke replied. "For letting me into your life and your heart. For making me a father and a husband. For teaching me that home is not a place, but the people you love." They went inside together, into the warmth and light and laughter of their home, surrounded by their children and their dear friend. And as Luke looked around at the life they had built, he felt nothing but gratitude for that day by the creek, for the crying woman who had changed everything forever. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. Mrs. Chen passed away in 1893, and the whole town mourned the loss of the kind woman who had helped so many. Florence especially grieved her friend and mentor, but she honored Mrs. Chen's memory by continuing the work they had started together, helping women in need find safety and new beginnings. Hope married in 1896 at the age of 17 to a good young man who worked as a schoolteacher in Delta. Luke walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny baby he had held in his arms for the first time nearly 18 years before. Samuel went to university in Laramie, studying law with the goal of becoming a lawyer like Daniel Wright, who had remained a close family friend over the years. And Lily, true to her spirited nature, announced at 15 that she intended to be a veterinarian, a profession almost unheard of for women but one that Luke and Florence supported wholeheartedly. Luke and Florence grew old together, their hair turning gray and their faces lining with the years, but their love for each other never dimming. They became grandparents in 1897, when Hope gave them a grandson, and then again in 1899 with a granddaughter. Luke loved being a grandfather, loved spoiling his grandchildren and telling them stories of the old days, of cattle drives and wild frontier towns, though he always left out the darker parts of his past. On a warm summer evening in June of 1900, as the new century was just beginning, Luke and Florence sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the plains just as they had done countless times before. They were both in their 60s now, but their hands still fit together perfectly, and their love was as strong as ever. "You have any regrets?" Florence asked suddenly. Luke thought about the question seriously. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret all those years I spent alone, running from place to place, afraid to care about anyone. I wish I had found you sooner, so we could have had even more time together." "We have had 22 years," Florence said. 22 wonderful years and 3 beautiful children and now grandchildren. That is more than many people ever get." "True," Luke agreed. "What about you? Any regrets?" Florence was quiet for a long moment. "Only that I waited so long to leave Conrad," she said. "If I had been braver sooner, maybe I would have found you earlier. But then again, maybe everything happened exactly as it was supposed to. Maybe we found each other at exactly the right moment when we were both ready to let someone in." "I think you are right," Luke said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Florence. I have loved you from that first day by the creek, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Florence said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for caring about a crying stranger. Thank you for giving me a life worth living." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built a love story that would last forever. The lonely cowboy who had once drifted aimlessly across the plains had found his home, and the frightened woman who had thought her life was over had discovered joy and hope and love beyond measure. And it all began with a simple act of kindness by a creek one summer day in Wyoming, when a cowboy heard crying and decided to stop, to care, to help. That decision had changed 2 lives forever, creating ripples that spread through time, touching their children and grandchildren and all the people they had helped along the way. As the darkness settled over the ranch and the crickets began their evening song, Luke pulled Florence closer and whispered, "We did good, did we not? We built something real and lasting. "We built everything," Florence replied. "We built a family, a home, a legacy of love. And it all started with you, Luke Frasier. It all started with your good heart and your willingness to help a stranger in need." Luke smiled in the darkness, holding his wife close, surrounded by the life they had created together. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more, and the crying woman by the creek had found joy beyond imagining. They had saved each other, loved each other, and built a life that would endure long after they were gone. And that, Luke thought as the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, was the very best kind of happy ending there could be.